For nearly 8 decades, the US dollar has ruled the world, not by force of arms, but by the silent empire of finance. It built prosperity, projected power, and gave America a throne above nations. But what if that throne is now a burden? Today, inflation surges, deficits swell, and global trust wavers. Allies diversify, rivals strike back, and at home, a once unshakable faith begins to crack. Is the dollar America's greatest weapon, or its fatal flaw? And as Donald Trump eyes a return to power, can one man reshape the fate of a currency and the empire it built? This is the story of how a symbol of strength became a source of danger, and what the future might hold when a nation's last trump card begins to falter. It began in the ashes of war. In 1944, as tanks rumbled across Europe, a quieter battle was being won in the hills of New Hampshire. At Bretton Woods, the United States, richer, untouched by bombs, offered the world a new anchor. The dollar, backed by gold, blessed by power. As Europe rebuilt and empires crumbled, the dollar remained. Even when Nixon unhooked it from gold in 1971, it only grew stronger, buoyed by oil, debt, and the global faith that America would always lead. Trade was priced in dollars, debt was issued in dollars, sanctions were enforced through dollars, the currency became a throne and a cage. But every empire leaves cracks. And now the world is watching for fractures. That was the birth of dollar hegemony, a financial empire not built on soldiers or swords, but on contracts, oil, and belief. For decades, it seemed like a win-win. For America especially, it appeared to be a masterstroke of economic statecraft. But what if the win was never truly a win? What if, beneath the glitter of global supremacy, there was a hidden cost, growing, festering, finally impossible to ignore? Today, we delve into a topic that shapes our global economy, a pillar of international finance: dollar hegemony. My premise, stated clearly from the outset, is this: dollar hegemony, for all its apparent prestige, should be brought to an end, and the sooner, the better. Now, let me be unequivocal. This assertion comes not from a position of antagonism towards the United States, but rather from a deep consideration of America's own best interests. The term dollar hegemony, it has a certain ring to it, a suggestion of American strength. But a closer examination reveals that the perceived benefits may be vastly overestimated. Indeed, for America itself, the positive effects are increasingly overshadowed by devastating costs. The price America pays to maintain this dominance is exorbitant, inflicting profound damage upon the nation itself. Therefore, for America's own sake, dollar hegemony must be dismantled. Before we explore the considerable harm inflicted upon the United States, let us briefly acknowledge the advantages dollar hegemony once conferred. Undeniably, it brought America significant benefits. The ability to finance its needs at an exceptionally low cost, the so-called exorbitant privilege or seigniorage, a constant inflow of global capital to support domestic consumption and investment, immense financial influence, and the power to wield the dollar as a formidable geopolitical weapon through sanctions. Yet, behind this glittering facade lie heavy burdens that have grown more pronounced with each passing year. So, what precisely is dollar hegemony, and how might it be concluded? These are the questions we will tackle today. Let's begin with the definition. Dollar hegemony refers to the process by which the US dollar, underpinned by America's economic, political, and military might, became the world's dominant and mainstream currency. This has led to a long-standing, asymmetrical, unilateral dependence on the dollar by other nations, shaping a global political and economic system with the dollar at its apex. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 is widely considered its genesis. Even after the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971, and the dollar's decoupling from gold, its hegemonic status not only persisted, but in fact intensified. There is a wealth of literature on dollar hegemony. Regrettably, much of it is penned by economists of a left-wing persuasion. They often approach the subject from a proletarian historical viewpoint, passionately denouncing dollar hegemony, yet few have rigorously examined the specific costs America itself has shouldered, the price the nation has paid for this dominance. To understand the steep price America has paid, let's consider this diagram, which vividly illustrates the global circulation of the US dollar. In simple terms, oil exporting nations sell crude oil to the United States and other countries. Since energy exports are predominantly settled in dollars, these nations accumulate vast dollar surpluses. What do they do with these dollars? They are channeled into importing goods and services, foreign aid, and investments, flowing to other regions like export-oriented countries, allied nations, and Europe. These areas in turn also see their dollar holdings grow, but cash dollars don't automatically appreciate. To make their dollars grow, these countries reinvest them in the United States, primarily because American financial markets are dollar-denominated and are generally perceived to offer high returns and good liquidity. Thus, the dollar completes a grand global circuit. In essence, the dollar, from its origin as issued currency, flows to oil exporters, then to nations providing goods and services, and finally returns to the US in the form of financial investments. This is the foundational mechanism of the global dollar system, the so-called dollar hegemony. Many countries and individuals worldwide rely on the dollar, holding it as a reserve asset, storing wealth in the form of dollar-denominated debt and equities. But herein lies a critical problem. When these internationally circulating dollars flow back into the US as financial investments, they do not, by and large, efficiently find their way into the real economy. This is primarily because returns in the real economy are often perceived as lower or riskier, or because there's a lack of sufficient high-quality investment projects. Instead, these funds are more easily drawn to the liquid, high short-term return allure of stock and bond markets, thereby fueling financial bubbles. This is the first major cost of dollar hegemony for America. The inflation of financial bubbles, concurrent with the risk of stagnation and decline in the real economy. Statistics from 2024 show that the total market capitalization of US companies has reached an astonishing $51 trillion, with American equities accounting for over half of the total global stock market value. By contrast, at the end of the 19th century, the US share was merely 15%. This meteoric rise in the stock market hasn't been evenly distributed over a century. Since the 1980s, following significant interest rate reductions and financial liberalization, US financial markets entered a period of explosive growth. Simultaneously, America's real economy began to face headwinds. Multinational corporations opted to outsource manufacturing to developing countries with lower labor costs, leading to widespread job losses for American manufacturing workers. These two spheres, finance and the real economy, are not just economic indicators, they represent distinct political forces. Behind finance and industry stand their respective political factions, their interests deeply intertwined. Consequently, the ascendancy of finance and the decline of manufacturing have, to a degree, equated to the rise of Wall Street's financial power and associated speculative interests, while the political influence of America's traditional working and agricultural classes has waned. This shift in the power dynamic is a significant factor in America's escalating internal tensions, largely a consequence of the economic structure forged by dollar hegemony. Dollar hegemony has granted the dollar unparalleled dominance, and in doing so, has allowed America's financial sector to achieve extraordinary, perhaps disproportionate, growth. This has, to some extent, upset the political and economic equilibrium. American manufacturing and the American working class have borne the brunt. This impact, it's no exaggeration to say, risks undermining the very foundations of the nation's long-term prosperity. America was not founded solely as a financial nation. Its origins lie in labor, invention, and creation. Its bedrock, its underlying ethos, is partly derived from the Puritan ideal of diligent work and enterprise. This ideal is starkly at odds with an over-reliance on financial speculation and the inflation of asset bubbles. Thus, the excessive financialization driven by dollar hegemony deviates significantly from America's traditional developmental principles and direction. Many today look at the surface, not the substance. They believe dollar hegemony offers only benefits to America with no drawbacks. But while it sounds impressive, the deep-seated damage to the United States is, in fact, immense. The second major harm inflicted by dollar hegemony is rapidly accumulating debt. the system itself creates intense stimuli on both the supply and demand sides. Globally, most nations hold dollars as reserve currency, creating relatively strong demand for them. To meet this demand and maintain equilibrium, the supply of dollars must also increase substantially. A primary form of dollar reserves is U.S. Treasury debt. Therefore, global demand for dollars translates indirectly into demand for U.S. debt. To meet this demand and to fund domestic expenditure, the U.S. government issues vast quantities of debt. This debt largely finances soaring public spending. The partial hollowing out of American industry has led to shifts in employment structures, subsequently increasing spending on social welfare and unemployment benefits, much of which is debt-funded. Simultaneously, maintaining global influence, including the dollar hegemony system itself, requires ever-increasing military and defense expenditure, all sustained by borrowing. The result? A relentlessly growing mountain of U.S. debt. By January 2025, national debt had already surpassed $36 trillion. Annual interest payments now consume around a fifth of federal revenue. The debt-to-GDP ratio has surged from below 40% in 1980 to over 107%, a level exceeding even that of World War II. For peacetime debt to surpass wartime levels is a clear indication that America's economic system is imbalanced and unhealthy, crying out for internal reform. The steep price America pays for dollar hegemony is not just a point of academic interest. It is the backdrop against which a new chapter in American politics may be unfolding. My point is that more traditional, conservative elements within the U.S. have recognized this problem and are seeking change. This is a key driver behind movements like MAGA, Make America Great Again. And it's for this reason that the U.S. government is now undertaking a series of economic reforms. A central focus of these reforms is to scrutinize and adjust the workings of dollar hegemony and its consequences, because it has become detrimental to the United States. What are these specific reform measures? And can they ultimately succeed? These are crucial questions we will now explore. When discussing comprehensive economic reform in the U.S., one cannot ignore the much-discussed concept known as the Mar-a-Lago Accord, whose foundational ideas are partly derived from a 2014 paper by former White House economic advisor Stephen Miller, titled A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. This report is considered a significant reference for understanding potential future directions of U.S. economic policy, proposing strategies to rebalance the American economy. The report argues that because the dollar is the global reserve currency, much of the demand for dollars and U.S. debt is not purely yield-driven. Consequently, this demand is relatively inelastic to economic returns. In other words, the dollar's exchange rate is often far higher than what would be required for balanced international trade. Meanwhile, U.S. imports vastly exceed exports, leading to chronic current account deficits. The export sector and manufacturing are severely impacted, and the entire economic structure is distorted. The report, therefore, outlines a comprehensive vision for economic reform. This diagram offers a clearer view of the main tenets of such reform proposals. On the left, we see an assessment of America's current economic situation, summarized in 5 points. First, a significant loss of manufacturing jobs. Second, a declining U.S. share of the global economy. Third, as America has become a consumer nation rather than a primary goods exporter, it suffers from chronic trade deficits, effectively living beyond its means. Fourth, the substantial costs of maintaining global security commitments. These costs exacerbate fiscal deficits, forcing the government into long-term debt. The picture is undeniably worrying. According to this analysis, a primary cause is an overvalued dollar. Nations worldwide hold dollars as reserve assets, not merely as tools for trade. The dollar, therefore, fails to function purely as a medium of exchange, instead becoming a kind of sedimentary asset. This means there's a clear imbalance between the total volume of dollars issued and the actual demand for dollars in international trade. Thus, this accord or similar proposals posits that a key solution is to allow the dollar's exchange rate to more accurately reflect its economic fundamentals. Now, let's examine the suggested measures on the right of the diagram. First, Familiar to many are tariff policies, increasing import duties to try and protect domestic manufacturing while generating some revenue. However, the absolute linchpin is exchange rate policy. To adjust the dollar's value, several methods are proposed. First, a multilateral currency agreement with other nations to negotiate a devaluation of the dollar within a basket of currencies, akin to the historic Plaza Accord. Second, the issuance of so-called century bonds, encouraging foreign governments to convert their short-term US Treasury holdings into these much longer maturity bonds, or to sell them on the market. When foreign governments sell short-term treasuries, it increases the supply of dollars available for investment, as they receive dollars for their bonds or cease reinvesting new dollars into short-term debt, theoretically exerting downward pressure on the dollar's exchange rate. Converting remaining debt to century bonds would also significantly extend repayment periods, alleviating short-term debt burdens. Third, to incentivize countries holding large amounts of US debt to adjust their portfolios, the US could consider imposing taxes or fees on Treasury transactions or holdings, increasing the cost of holding US debt. Furthermore, the US Treasury could actively purchase foreign currencies as reserves, thereby influencing foreign exchange markets and encouraging a dollar depreciation. In short, the aim is to adjust the dollar's exchange rate to a more sustainable level. If implemented, these measures are projected to significantly boost the competitiveness of US exports, thereby attempting to revitalize American manufacturing and ultimately achieve a healthier US economy. The plan, as you can see, outlines very specific steps. But can it be fully executed? Will it achieve the desired results? An old adage comes to mind: the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Or perhaps more aptly, the plans are ambitious, but reality has a way of biting back. The implementation of this plan will likely fall short of its goals. Why? Consider the proposed solutions. Multilateral currency agreements require cooperation among many nations. If other countries, due to conflicting interests, refuse to cooperate with a negotiated dollar depreciation, this approach will falter. Similarly, initiatives like century bonds and compelling other nations to sell US debt will face resistance and non-cooperation. These measures are unlikely to achieve their intended effects entirely. Nevertheless, an adjustment in the dollar's exchange rate may still occur, albeit likely a limited one. After all, the policy gyrations under the Trump administration have already caused short-term dips in the US economy, which will naturally influence the dollar's trajectory. In the longer term, as dollar sanctions are increasingly applied against countries like China and other entities, some economies may reduce or be unable to use dollars in specific transactions. This could somewhat dampen global demand for the dollar in certain regions and for certain uses. If dollar supply doesn't contract correspondingly, the dollar could theoretically face a situation of relative oversupply and marginally weakened demand. According to supply and demand principles, this would put downward pressure on its price. However, any decline in the dollar will be constrained. The ultimate goal of such policies is not to cripple the US economy, but to revitalize it, to enhance its relative global competitiveness. Yet looking at this chart, we see that historically, America's share of global GDP and the dollar index have shown a degree of positive correlation. If the US economy strengthens and its GDP share rises, the dollar index typically also rises. This implies a potential inherent contradiction between the goals of making America great again and significantly devaluing the dollar. Therefore, one plausible scenario is that the dollar's value over a period might trace a shallow U-shaped curve, declining initially, then gradually stabilizing and recovering as the US economy seeks adjustment and potential revival. In the short term, then, assets that hedge against dollar risk, such as the Swiss franc and gold, may indeed offer a degree of capital preservation. Then there's tariff policy. Statistical charts show that current US-W tariff levels are indeed among the lowest in its history, and tariff revenue as a percentage of total government income is also at a historic low. However, this doesn't automatically mean that raising tariffs will generate substantial new revenue. The higher the tariff rate, the fewer countries and goods may be exported to the US, shrinking the tax base and thus affecting actual revenue. Some argue that a 25% tariff rate is the practical limit. Beyond that, shrinking trade volumes could actually reduce overall tariff income. Estimates suggest that under ideal conditions, increased tariffs might bring in a few $100 billion annually. But US national debt, as we've noted, exceeds $36 trillion. Tariff revenue, therefore, remains a drop in the ocean compared to this colossal debt. America cannot escape its debt predicament through tariffs alone. Another aspect is the much-touted reshoring of manufacturing. As this chart indicates, America's trade deficit is staggering and long-standing. It's unlikely to be easily reversed. Even if a weaker dollar creates opportunities for US manufacturing, concerns remain about the work ethic and willingness to engage in such labor among younger generations. This issue is linked to certain tendencies within the American education system and broader shifts in societal attitudes. Since the end of World War II, a significant number of academics in American universities have tended to propagate certain left-wing ideologies. These ideologies often lean towards deconstructing traditional work values while emphasizing social distribution and welfarism. They do not encourage the tenacious, traditional Puritan work ethic. Instead, they may objectively foster an attitude in some of lying flat, expecting comfort and increased state benefits. After decades of such influence, a considerable portion of university graduates have been, it could be argued, deeply affected, even poisoned, by these ideas. Financial corruption may manifest on Wall Street, but a more profound issue is the ideological and moral decay in America, which undoubtedly has roots in its major universities. It's no exaggeration to say that some American universities have, to a certain extent, become societal tumors. They produce wave after wave of what might be termed infantilized adult children. Lazy, yet aggressive. These individuals now constitute a significant proportion of the US population. This situation will inevitably depress the average American's willingness to work. If the will to work is too low, then talk of a manufacturing renaissance is merely aspirational. Historically, dollar hegemony was beneficial to the United States, but at this juncture, it is undeniably causing great harm. It needs to be reevaluated and adjusted, a choice made in America's own long-term interest. However, based on my analysis, any economic measures America adopts will likely see their effectiveness diluted in practice. And there's an unavoidable reality. No matter how America reforms or adjusts, it cannot return to its foundational state. Over so many years, America's social and cultural landscape has undergone profound transformations. So, what the US government is currently attempting can perhaps be understood as an effort to make the American economy somewhat healthier. Let's use an analogy. America is like a middle-aged man who has acquired some unhealthy habits, perhaps alcoholism and smoking, which have severely compromised his health. The US government, like a doctor, offers advice and a treatment plan, urging him to rediscover a healthy lifestyle and kick his bad habits. It's as simple and as complex as that. But regardless of the diagnosis or treatment, America remains a mature entity, a middle-aged man. It cannot revert to its youth, let alone its childhood. America faces its future, its old age, an inevitable stage in the historical life cycle, unyielding to subjective human will. But when we speak of bringing manufacturing back, the real question goes deeper. It's not just about the dollar, or labor costs, or supply chains. We must ask, honestly, how many young Americans today are still willing to get their hands dirty? To sweat? To build something real with steel, with bolts, with skill? For decades, the illusion of dollar omnipotence taught generations to believe that wealth could be conjured, leveraged, speculated, extracted. We trained hedge wizards, not builders. We celebrated influence but dismissed the dignity of hands-on work. We chased the art of narrative and forgot the labor behind substance. But a nation that forgets how to work will one day forget how to stand. Dollar hegemony is not just an economic arrangement. It is a cultural addiction. It teaches us to harvest from the world, but give nothing real in return. It lets us consume others' labor, while scorning labor at home. It grants elites infinite leverage, while stripping working people of grounded dignity. Now it begins to poison its own host. Yes, Dollar supremacy is eroding America's institutions, hollowing out its economy and fraying the civic fabric from within. It must end. Not for China, not for the global south, but for the United States itself. Only when we let go of the dream of buying the world with printed promises can we remember what it means to produce, to take responsibility, to rebuild with purpose. Only when we put our hands to the foundation again, not just rest atop the scaffold of supremacy, can we say America deserves to be great again. In the long march toward a new global order, the United States may no longer lead the way. But it can still choose not to be the first empire that falls.